All right, next up we've got Jason Harmon. Hey, Jason.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, all right. I am a 3D generalist, motion graphics artist. I operate out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the U.S. I've been doing motion graphics and design animation for about 18 years. I started out years ago as an editor, then got into more motion graphics, always with a passion for 3D. Like I started out in Cinema 4D back in my college days in the early 2000s, and been using that for a while. And then somewhere along the way, just transitioned all of my work into Houdini, mostly over the past 5 or 6 years.
Right on. So what are you going to be talking about today?
Today I'm going to be talking about the scene that I built for the rural prompt, and it's a scene with a handful of mailboxes and rocks. I grew up in rural Alabama, so it was kind of that's what came to my head. That's what I remember. It's just long dirt roads and endless mailboxes. So I'm going to talk about that and how I built it up, how to take just a handful of assets and really stretch those and make the most out of them in a scene using some of the scattering tools and also a bit of procedural modeling. And hopefully, if I get to it without running out of time, how to render those things efficiently in Redshift.
Right on. Well, let's jump in.
Yeah, thanks so much. Today I'm going to be talking about my approach to building this scene, which was my entry for the Day of Rural. As an overview, here's the topics I'm going to be talking about today. First, I'm going to talk about modeling our hero asset, the mailbox, and how I was thinking about adding variation to each copy of this, and building the first asset to accommodate those changes. I'm also going to be talking about blocking out the scene, how making a few decisions up front can save you a lot of time and show you where you need to focus your energy, not wasting effort on things that won't be seen by the camera. I'm also going to quickly show how I created and prepped the assets I used in the scattering system, the rocks and the grass. The bulk of this talk is going to be focused on showing how to build a reusable scattering system using the scatter and align tools. Next, I'll go over quickly where I sourced textures. Then lastly, I'll talk about lighting and rendering and using Redshift post effects to add light compositing and color for the final look. Quickly, I'm going to go over how I modeled this mailbox. To begin, I just used basic polygon modeling tools. I added some subdivisions so I would have enough detail. I split the door off and then added a transform so I could have some of the versions of the mailbox with an open door. For the posts, it's just simple boxes, the 45-degree angles booled and beveled. And then here you'll see how I took one mailbox, duplicated it many times, and then in world space repositioned and rotated each copy to add variation. Then per box I went in and started manipulating some of the elements to have more variation. I opened some of the doors, added or removed latches. I changed some of the styles of the posts, made some round, some fatter or skinnier. And then lastly I wanted to add some dents and to make the mailboxes look old and weathered. I did this by using an edit SOP with a soft select and just pushed and pulled points until I was happy with the look. Once I had the mailboxes in place, the next thing I knew I needed to do was to lock in the camera's position. And here's why. My scene's not very large, and I knew that there were going to be issues with it. Here's the back edge of my scene, and I knew I wouldn't have time to model any other scene elements to cover this up. I was only have time to model the rocks and the grass and the mailboxes themselves. So to help with this, I knew I wanted to be close and focus on the mailboxes. I also knew that I wanted to use shallow depth of field, sort of hoping that would cover some of my issues that are going on back here. This angle is the angle that I ended up on, and once I blocked out the camera, a lot of other things started to fall into place. I did some tests with the shallow depth of field, and I saw that this front mailbox was going to go soft, so I thought that would be pretty forgiving. I also could tell that how far I needed to extend the back and the side of my landscape. I saw that with the soft focus, the edges of this were going to blend okay with the HDRI dome that I was going to use for lighting. And then when I moved on to the texturing, or when I moved on to the scattering tools, having a locked-in camera allowed me to spend time focusing and concentrating detail where it was going to be the most visible and not really stressing out about trying to populate this whole scene. Locking in the camera allowed me to concentrate efforts on where they'd be the most visible. For creating the rocks I scattered, I referred back to a tutorial by Fabrizio Chamon. He shows you how to make really nice procedural rocks using a series of noises. So in this quick breakdown of that, I started with a sphere and I roughed out the shape with an edit sop. I added noise and then used a VDB operation to convert and remesh that. And then I just layered up that noise again to get finer detail. And finally at the end, I poly reduce it knowing that I'm going to scatter this a lot of times. And also here's the grass that I made. This was relatively easy. I just took a single curve with a bend on it, and I used that in a copy to points, and then I put the copy to points inside a for each loop, and that way I could vary the length and the amount of the bend per instance of the curve. To make the seed head, I used a sweep sop with a round profile, and then I used this channel ramp to vary the width of the sweep to imitate the shape of grass with a seed head at the top. So next we get to the real heart of the talk. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the scatter and align tools and how I use these to take just a handful of elements and distribute those randomly over a given surface to create a lot of visual interest from really just a few elements. So right here I've got my 4 rocks. I've gone ahead and brought these in to this object, and each is a different shape. I've merged all these together, and I've deleted any of the incoming attributes I didn't want. And then I've created a class attribute using the connectivity sop, and I'm gonna use that to define the pieces that we'll use in the scatter and align tool. Going back to our locked-in camera, I'm gonna paint where I want rocks to be. To do that, I'm gonna use a group paint node. So I'm gonna paint right along this ridge, and maybe right here, and then maybe a little over here. And you can go back and you can adjust this later on after we get a sense of how the rocks are looking. So the scatter and align tool expects primitive groups, but the group paint node creates point groups. So I'm going to use a group promote to convert that. We just need to set this from points to primitives and then select the group we want to promote. And now I'm going to drop down a scatter and align, and then I'm going to plug that in, and right off it scatters points everywhere, which is not what I want. So we need to limit that to the group that I just created. And then we see that we only have 1 point, but this isn't broken. It's doing the right thing. It's using our group. But the reason for this is the scattering method defaults to size. And right now my points have a minimum and maximum radius that's way too high. So I need to change that. I want my minimum radius to be more along the lines of 0.02 and my maximum to be around 0.1. And that's far too many. I changed my uniform scale, so I need to bring that back up. And now it's going to generate quite a few points, and that's going to be pretty good to start with. Now to see the effect of this, I'm going to grab a copy to points. And what I want to do is I want to feed the points that I just created in here, and I want to grab one of these rocks just for visualizing. But before I connect that, I want to turn on pack and instance. That's going to make my viewport a lot more responsive. So right off we can see that the rocks are far too large, and though it's conforming to the surface normal of this ridge, which is what I want, all of these are also pointing in the same direction, which isn't what I want. So we're gonna fix that. But before I do that, I want to address the scaling. Now, what I tend to do is to use an attribute randomize to fix this. So I'm going to change the parameter to p scale, and the reason why all the rocks jumped up in size like this is that my operation was set to value rather than to multiply the incoming value, which is what we want. I want to multiply my incoming value by these randomized values. Let me change this this to 1 that doesn't have multiple dimensions. I want to raise my minimum value from 0 to just raise that up a bit, and then take my maximum value down. And now you can control this the way this randomizes the numbers. A number of ways you can do that with the ramps or however you want, but for this demo, this is going to be fine. Now what I want to address are these directional issues. The scatter and align tool not only has controls for how the points are created, but also has several sliders here to control the orientation angle of each point. The ones that you're going to be most concerned with are probably going to be these rotation around normal sliders. This is going to set the amount of variation in the angle around the up vector for each object that's copied onto each point. So I'm going to set this between 0 and 360 to get the most variation in their orientations. And now for the maximum cone angle slider, this is going to randomize your up vector. And let me actually turn on point normals here on the template points so you can see better what's going on. And now you see these normals. Here they're being inherited from the surface, and that's what's defining the up vector on each rock. But when we change the cone angle slider, what we do is we randomize that. And you may or may not want this depending on the geometry that you're scattering, but it does add more variation, particularly for this setup. So now we have one rock that's scattered on our surface with random orientation and random scale, and it's looking pretty good, but I want to get this entire library scattered on these points, not just the one piece. And I want this one piece per point, or one rock per point. So we have a class attribute over here on our geometry library, and that's what I'm calling this group of rocks. But we need to add matching attribute to our points. And one way to do that is with the attribute from pieces SOP. So what this SOP asks for is a geometry library and a point cloud. So my geometry library is over here, it's my rocks, and my point cloud is my template points. So now what we're going to do is, in its parameter, it says, okay, what is the name of your piece attribute? It defaults to name, but that's not what mine is. Mine is class. That's what I have defined. That's what I have defining the pieces of my rocks. So as soon as I click that over to class, you can see that these points now have a class attribute that matches the class attribute for my rocks. So right now I have 4 rocks, so I get a class attribute from 0 to 3, which is randomly assigned to these points now. Now if I had 10 points, I'd get matching attribute on the points, on these template points that would iterate over every 10 points. So now, rather than feeding the points that don't have any class attribute on them into the copy to points, I need to feed my points with the matching class attribute in there to copy the rocks onto. And rather than feeding in a single rock, what I need to do is feed in the group of them, feed in this merge. So now right off the bat, that didn't do what I wanted. And that is because there's one last parameter set. Now you can see that I've got the whole chunk of rocks being copied onto every point. And the reason for that is that I need to set a piece attribute inside my copy to points SOP as well. Now that defaults to variant, but what we're going to change this to is class, because that's what we defined earlier as our piece attribute. So as soon as I did that, what you can see is that each incoming template point that had a class of 0 has the rock with the matching class attribute copied onto it, and so on and so forth for 1, 2, and 3. And now the great thing is that once this is all built out, if I wanted to add 5 more rocks, I could just merge them in here to this merge node, and everything else will ripple through. And that to me is really, really powerful. And so now I can go back to my camera angle, and if I wanted to add more rocks, I can add more rocks there. Or if I want to take some away, let me remember. No, yep, it's the middle mouse button will erase. Yeah, there we go. So you can erase rocks, you can add more. It's a pretty robust system. And using this, you can build up a ton of detail with just a handful of assets. All right, so lastly, what I want to do is so we've got random scale, random orientation, positions. I'm using 4 different variations of rocks. So I've got a lot of variation as it is, but I want each rock to have a randomized color as well. So a quick way to do this is, again, to use the connectivity SOP, but this time, rather than overriding my class attribute, I'm just going to create an attribute called ramp. And you can call that whatever you want. The important thing is we just get an attribute that's based on connectivity. And then I'm going to take this color SOP that I used for my, my render. And now when you make a color SOP, when you just drop one down, it defaults to constant color. But what I want to do is to do a ramped color from an attribute. And this is the color ramp that I want to apply across all of my rocks. So first I'll need to feed it the attribute that we just created in that last connectivity SOP. And that's a ramp. So let's see the range of that ramp attribute. Here it is. It goes to 483. And so we've got 483 rocks. So my ramp range, that's my ramp range, I want to set that to 483. Now you can do this in a more procedural way than just typing it in. You can reference that number. You can reference that a number of ways. It's just the number of template points. So you can definitely make that more procedural, but just for the sake of this demo, this is going to be okay. Now I've got random colors per rock based on this gradient, and I'm going to feed that into Redshift for my final render. Again, this is all to layer up some visual complexity, only working with 4 assets. Now let's take a look at the setups that I used in the actual render. It's the same type of setup. Here's the grass and the rocks combined. The rock setup was exactly the same, still using the same 4 input rocks, but I scattered more of them. I've got about 2,000 or so here. Same color ramp, same setup. The grass setup, I have only 2 variations of grass, one tall with seed head and one without. And that's how I built the scatter setup for my render. Really quickly, I want to talk about texturing. I used a lot of Megascans materials and substance source materials over the course of Mardini. It was a big time saver, and also using the Megascans plugin to bridge worked really nice. It works great once it's all set up. I can also recommend using DMNK Tools, which has a script for automating the process of making Redshift materials from texture inputs of the various channels. Lastly, I'm going to talk about the lighting and rendering and using some Redshift post effects to add a little bit of compositing right inside of Houdini. What we see here is the raw render without any post effects applied. And honestly, it's not looking that great. There are some nice things about it, but there are also a lot of problems as well. You can see pretty clearly where the ground meets the HDRI, and you can see that these textures on this front mailbox, they're really not looking very nice. There's also some bad UVs on the front that are stretching the texture. And again, I was moving very quickly with this, so once I got to this point, it was just a matter of trying to make what I had look as good as I could. I'm going to jump around a little bit, talk about the lighting next. The lighting was really simple. It's all from one HDRI dome that I grabbed from HDRI Haven. I just went on their site and found a rural looking scene, and one that I felt like it sort of matched the tone that I wanted. I just tried to find a good angle to set the light at. I wanted the light to come from this direction, and that was basically it. I didn't want to overthink it. It's an outdoor scene. I didn't need multiple lights. There's only one sun in real life, so I thought an HDRI would work, and I didn't want to really stress out about the lighting. And again, I really didn't spend much time dialing it in other than just trying to find the best angle. Certain angles are going to work better than others with any HDRI, and what I was really interested in were the details on this plastic mailbox here. And when the light hits it almost straight on, you get some nice subsurface scattering from the plastic material. So that's one of the things I wanted visible. And I also liked how the light played on the rocks down on that ridge. I also didn't want to draw any attention to the background where my terrain dropped off. I just didn't want that. And another sort of way to cover up some of these rough details in the scene was to use shallow depth of field. I already knew that, and so when I turn that on, it really smooths out a lot of what's going on back in the distance, and it also obscures some of the bad texturing that I had on this front mailbox. It really helped out a lot. Other things I did was just to add a little bit of color correction. I used the Redshift color controls and tweaked the curves. I added some reds, boosted the mids, just basic color correction like you would do in Photoshop or anywhere else. I also used photographic exposure. I didn't change many settings. I really just wanted to add a vignette to this. And again, I wanted to draw as much attention as I could to these mailboxes and get as much attention away from the problems in the background as I could. And lastly, I added a little bit of bloom just to add some soft highlights to the front of the mailboxes. Anywhere where the areas were brighter, wanted to add a little bit of soft highlights there. And that's really it. This is the image that I ended up posting. Despite all the issues it had, it was pretty well received. I ended up being happy with it as well. It wasn't an entry that I expected to be well received or win anything. I definitely didn't expect to be asked to talk about it, but here we are, and I hope this was helpful for anybody who's watching. So to recap, I went over how to model the mailbox asset with the goal of duplicating it a lot of times and adding variation to each of those copies. I talked about the benefit of locking in a camera angle early and how that can help you focus your efforts on detail and help you work more efficiently. I showed briefly how the assets I scattered were built and how those were prepped for scattering. And then I walked through how to build a flexible scattering system to scatter a library of assets across the surface by painting. I talked about my go-to places for quickly sourcing textures. And then lastly, I showed how I lit and rendered my scene and used Redshift post effects to add the finishing touches. So thank you so much for watching.